Hi, my name's Phil. I like talking about politics, and in this video I like to discuss the Home Secretary's latest scheme to wreck our economy and access to essentials. Priti Patel has announced that her department will no longer accept ID cards for entry into the UK. This may just be a future government U-turn developing before our eyes, and maybe a big one at that. But first, if you'd like to be notified of daily news and politics, please subscribe to the channel and click the bell notification icon. So on a personal level, I don't have a passport. Not had one since I was very young. I'm not really a traveller. And when I have travelled outside the UK, it has only been to other EU countries. Basically, I've not needed a passport really for my adult life. So I can imagine that there are a lot of people in my position. You know, perhaps some of these people are EU citizens, not resident in Britain, will sometimes come across to Britain. Some of them might even be bringing out much needed supplies of food and medicines. But more likely, I suppose, we've just shut down what's left of our tourism industry. But before I go into the specific details, I'd like to point something out. The Home Secretary is here pointing out that ID cards are insecure. That's what she said, insecure. Now, two things here. First of all, the government are legislating to make the use of ID cards compulsory in this country in order to vote in future elections. Why are the government planning on requiring something that's insecure in order to vote? But secondly, ID cards are not any more insecure than a passport. How could they be? Which presumably will be accepting, won't they? They'll have to accept passports. How could they be less secure? They serve largely the same purpose and are issued by the same people, the government of whichever country you are a citizen of. So I'd love to know what makes ID cards insecure but passports not. Priti Patel pointed us to the government website which contained all the details, but unfortunately this detail seemed lacking. There was a statement saying that half of all false documents detected at the border were the Swiss EU or EEA identity cards, but this is basic mathematics. You could only use that figure to say they are less secure than other forms of identity if fewer than half of all forms of identity used were ID cards. But they're actually a very common form used at the border, or at least were before last Friday when the new rules came into effect. But anyway, never mind the justification. What will be the impact? About 45% of all EU citizens have ID cards but not passports. So I'm not alone in not feeling the need for one. I'm in good company. There's like 200 million people, and that's just in the EU. And it's not just the case that those 200 million EU citizens without a passport simply don't go travelling. Some will fall into that category, sure. That's a pretty good reason for not having a passport. Don't actually like leaving the country. But many just bob around Europe with their national identity card. So now it's not allowed. Now imagine that you are a citizen of, say, Portugal. You might quite like a trip to Britain. Let's say you want to photograph the wonders of Brexit Britain, you know, the empty chicken shelves, the punch up at the petrol station, the world's biggest food bank directory and so on. But you won't now be allowed to sally forth with your trusted identity card. Are you going to just have to go ahead and sort out a passport now? Are you eckers like? All that hassle and expense when you don't need it for any other purpose? Sod that, you'll just go to Ireland instead, won't you? Granted, you might not get to see a fight at a petrol station, but it's a holiday destination with much less hassle. In fact, I saw someone make the excellent point that a lot of school trips would be out of the question now. Again, that's the same with holidays. It's really not worth the hassle and expense of sorting out the passports just to visit our little plague island when you have the rest of Europe to wander around much more freely. In fact, school trips will be a bigger issue because, like with holidays, generally households will either have passports or won't. A family, will have passports. Everyone will have passports or no one will. So the families that do could still go to Britain. Those who don't can't. With a school trip, like a whole class, the organisers, the teachers know that it's going to be a mixture of kids who do have passports and those who don't. So it's not going to be worthwhile you're not going to be able to say to those kids, right, you need to get passports now. It's not going to happen. So none of them will be visiting Britain, even the ones with passports. The same guy by the name of Edwin Hayward also talked about conferences. And then, again, another good point. Same sort of thing, but for adults, really. Why would you book a conference in Britain and risk a load of delegates not being able to travel to it because they don't have passports? You wouldn't. And it's not likely that it would absolutely have to be held in Britain. So you just choose somewhere else. But those are the factors that will hurt our economy, but in a way that the government could well get away with, because it's not going to be that obvious a cause and effect for many. A reduction in tourism from the EU could be put down to all sorts of things, and the government will absolutely put it all down to COVID. You know, that is, when it comes to things like tourism, that is an excuse that will work for years from now. But of more concern to me is that of haulage. Like, our government is failing to put Brexit import controls in place, specifically because we cannot afford to reduce the flow of goods from the rest of Europe. We are utterly dependent upon imports for food and medicines. And now that our food production has been reduced, thanks to a lack of workers in key sectors, we are having to try and import even more food. I talked yesterday, I think it was yesterday, the sequence keeps getting messed up, about how we're going to need to import hundreds of thousands of turkeys from the EU when we used to supply ourselves entirely before Brexit. Well, the same is true of other meat products, as well as fruit and veg. We need more because we're producing less. And those imports have to be bought by lorry drivers, have to be brought into the country by and large by lorry drivers. We don't have the British lorry drivers to manage on their own. And it's difficult enough to persuade EU lorry drivers as it is. It's inefficient, and they run the risk of being stuck at the border, potentially at both ends, for who knows how long, to say nothing of the worry about getting toilet facilities, and now even petrol. You know, because the parts of the country that are still suffering from shortages are the parts of the country they access us from, like the south and the southeast. It's our largest port. And all of these factors feed into each other. Like I've tried to point this out before. Each of the problems that either Brexit, COVID, or just the government in general has landed us with can be bad on their own, but when they interact, they make a bad situation into a crisis. We already have multiple crises going off at once at the moment. You know, the Brexiteers are keen, for example, to point out global supply issues. Yes, there are very serious problems of global supply, most of which are related to the pandemic. So why did we choose to compound the problem with Brexit? Because that's what we did. We knew the pandemic was disrupting supply chains, and we still chose to exit the transition period when we were invited to extend it. That was our government's choice, nobody else's. As such, it's the government's responsibility to deal with the fact that global issues aside, we are the only country in our region to have empty shelves, empty petrol pumps, a shortage of medical supplies, rocketing energy prices, and not enough staff to sustain our economy. So we had all that, and now you compound the crisis further by adding into the mix that some EU lorry drivers will now not be able to bring loads into Britain. And it may well be that lorry drivers are more likely than the general population to have a passport. I don't know. What I do know is that some of them will not really have needed one if they were just bouncing around most of the EEA. So it seems likely to me that some lorry drivers that bob along between the EU and Britain now will have been doing so without a passport. As such, I would say there's a non-zero number of lorry drivers who had previously been happy to make these runs, or at least prepared to make these runs, who will not now be able to do so. We're not really in a position to be telling any lorry drivers to bugger off back where they came from. It didn't really go last time we did that. So we'll have to see how this one runs. I wouldn't be at all surprised if this is another government U-turn in the making, because a minister is putting forward a policy that they haven't thought through. But those are my thoughts. Let me know yours in the comments below. Hope you found the video interesting. If you did, don't forget to click the like button. If you'd like to support the channel further, please also click the Patreon link for details. And until next time, I'll see you later.